Can you see me? Because I can.
And then you go to that. Can you see me?
I can see it. Yeah, and I can see start recording now too. Oh, good. I didn't know I could do that.
Yeah.
Exciting.
And then I sent you a link on how you can download it to your phone or your computer, and then you can share it where you want.
I will do that. I'll actually, what I'll do is I'll share it on my YouTube channel. So.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I've been noticing your channel, but let me get a normal intro, and then we'll get going, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Welcome to Crossing Crown Radio, everybody, and the Gospel Truth Podcast. Today, it's great delight. I have a wonderful guest, S.J. Thomason, and she's on the front lines as an apologist and a speaker. S.J. is actively engaging atheist unbelievers on Twitter, YouTube, and the public arena. So please subscribe to her channel if you have a chance. It's Christian Apologist on YouTube, or of course you can also look it up at S.J. Thomason, and her website is christian-apologist.com. Welcome, S.J. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's so good to have you. I've been looking at your channel a lot recently. You've been having some really great shows. It's amazing the diversity that you've been having lately.
Thank you.
Oh, you bet. My first question for you is, why and how did you get involved in apologetics ministry? And tell us a little bit about yourself if you want.
Okay, well, I was born and raised a Catholic, and I left the Catholic faith in my early 20s with my family. Most of my family left it too. And we went our separate ways, and my sister stayed in the Catholic Church, but the rest of us left. And then in my early 40s, I started having spiritual experiences, it seemed, and I started sort of coming back to God, and I started realizing that all of the years that I wasted not finding God and understanding Christianity as I hadn't at that time were terrible. So I wanted to come back, and I wanted to come back in a major way. And I started to write a book in about 2014, a couple of Christian fiction books that were about young adults, and I thought I'd promote them on Twitter. So I got on Twitter, and whenever I did Christian hashtags, all of these atheists started finding me. And I really don't know any atheists in real life very well. So I discovered this whole atheist community and how sometimes they can be a little bit hostile, but they definitely weren't going to believe any of my own personal stories. So I started getting into apologetics. So I started reading. C.S. Lewis was a game changer for me, the book Mere Christianity. And then I've read a lot of books now. I've actually got my computer sitting on a pile of books. books from Sean McDowell and who else do we have here? In the few books I have right here, Alvin Schmidt, Sean McDowell. I also have J. Warner Wallace, Nancy Pearcey, Ken Samples, Hugh Ross. I've just done a deep dive into apologetics because I feel that I lost so much time. I want to try to gain it back and make it up to God. So that's what I'm doing.
That's wonderful, because your approach is very unique, and you seem fearless. I'm really blessed by watching your ministry. You will dialogue with anybody about anything, and you're very patient and kind, and yet you're also bold. And I know a lot.
Thank you.
Oh, you bet. I've noticed, people really benefit from your dialogues with atheists and unbelievers. What inspires you to go to the front line? I mean, most apologists, we're kind of okay writing a few books and throwing some videos out there, but you really engage these folks.
Yes, well, because I feel that this is a serious issue. This is really life or death in some ways. And I would like to meet many of these people that I've encountered in heaven. And so if there's any little planting of a seed that I can do, anything that God wants to work through me, I ask God every day when I get up. I say, if there's a way that you want to work through me today to get to somebody, if you want me to say something to someone, just let me know, give me a sign, and please do that. And so that's why I feel fearless. I feel that I have the Lord behind me, and I feel that in some ways he's trying to work through me. And I think that there are some people I've encountered that will eventually come to Christianity. So It's all worth it. If there's only one over my entire lifetime, it's worth it. And so that's how I think.
That's a great way to think. And I know there's a lot more than that. I can recall a time where I was outreaching to a gentleman, very hostile atheist, very aggressive. And he said, Mike, I don't care what evidence you give me, what proof, I'm never, ever going to believe. And he just really got mad and stormed off. And this was after a few months of dialogue with him. And then I didn't see him for about a year. And he came up to me a year later and said, Mike, you won't believe it. I got saved. And now I'm over here doing apologetics at this church.
No way. That's excellent.
So
that's a dream.
Yeah. And your approach is your approach is unique, so I really like it. And that's one reason I wanted you on the show so much. And, the Western culture, so much of it seems to be being divisive now, that you have the one side where Christians are trying to uphold the Christian worldview. Then you have the other side that seems to say, well, forget the Christian worldview. Not only don't we have to abide by it, now we're going to be hostile against it. What do you think Christians should do about that?
You're right. I've seen a lot of that. And I think one thing that we should do is we should educate people on exactly what Christianity has brought to the table. Because if we go back a couple thousand years and look at the way the Roman Empire was and the way pagans were, they were completely immoral. They were incestuous. They engaged in all kinds of awful sexually immoral practices. They actually found pottery and things like that with evidence of these kind of relationships that they were having, and it just shows that they were in the doghouse, and they would cast their unwanted babies out into the streets to die. They would do all sorts of things. They of course had the Roman Colosseum, which Christians helped to end, but they had the Roman Colosseums where they'd parade people to death and have them mauled by animals. So they were completely an immoral group of people. And what happened was they started noticing that the Christians were operating in a different way. They noticed that the Christian women, for example, weren't there cheating on their husbands and prostituting themselves. And they were really amazed at how the Christians were acting, because the Christians were trying to follow their leader in Christ, and they were trying to be as Christ-like as possible. And so the way the Christians were acting was actually helping a lot of people to convert to Christianity who had become very disgusted with that culture. And then if you go over the centuries, you'll see that Christians were engaged in Christians were involved in the abolition of slavery. They were, of course, there were some involved in starting slavery and perpetuating it, but they were definitely involved in the abolition of slavery. Christians helped to found many very strong Ivy League universities. Christians were the ones who decided that we needed hospitals not just for the soldiers, but for everyone. And that went back to a few hundred years into Christianity. So, and then in the first 300 years of Christianity, Christians were systematically, quite frequently persecuted under Nero, under Diocletian, and under other emperors. So they were mistreated, mauled, beaten, stoned, everything bad. They did not, this was a very peaceful religion with peaceful roots that came to 5 to 6 million people before Constantine legalized them officially in 313. So this very peaceful religion is very unlike, say, the Muslim faith, because the Muslim faith came to power through conquering and through battles, and Muhammad actually went out there and slaughtered a bunch of people. So if people just look at the example of Christ and how he's changed people and how we're still striving, we still haven't reached the pinnacle where we're matching up with his standard of what morality is, but we're certainly aiming towards it. And we've seen societies gradually become a little bit better year after year. And so I think people need to be reminded of all the benefits that Christianity has brought to the table. And I think that helps. And another thing is as hard as it is, we have to always remember 1 Peter 3:15. If someone asks us a question, and they're asking it in a very sincere way, we are not supposed to just shut the doors on them or make fun of them or do anything like that. We're supposed to answer their question. And one of the reasons why I've come to Apologetics is because I want to be able to give them the right answer to their question. And Apologetics offers a lot of information. So,
yeah, notice you take that really seriously and apply it, which is not always easy for us to do. But I love the parallel that you made with Rome. And with my experience, I'm in my 50s, and when I was a child, I was raised as a non-believer, a really good, normal home, if you will, but not going to church, no God, and so forth. And everybody in my family's lifestyle was similar. No Christianity, no religion, but they were all really nice folks. And in those days, it seemed like the non-Christian culture kind of followed the Christian worldview, even if they didn't believe in it, right? Like my parents didn't lie and cheat and do all these crazy stuff. But I think about 10 years ago, and definitely under the Obama administration, the secular folks figured, wait a minute here, we're not Christians. We don't have to uphold Christianity and its morals, so they don't believe it. Now they're not practicing it. And you can see that with a lot of the protests.
You're right. And you can see, I've noticed in Europe where it's become increasingly secular, there have been some studies that have come out that say they've been veering away from religion and tradition and veering towards what they call rational secularism. And in these places, we're starting to see the I think we're starting to see some more immoral practices because people are veering away from Christianity. So, for example, there's in England, I saw something where there's I think it's a hospital where people can go and bring their kids, I'm talking as young as 6 and 4 years old, I've heard in some cases, to have sex change operations and that kind of thing. And so there apparently was a protest by some people who were working in that place. And they said, wait a second, children, it's one thing to have young adults or someone else who wants to make a decision about their bodies, but children, I don't think should be even given the choice, in my opinion.
That's amazing. And that's why your work and others is so important, because if we win the hearts and we win the minds, I think the main answer is for people to be born again, for them to become Christian. I don't think just changing laws is good, and upholding righteous laws in our civil society is good, but it's a matter of the heart, that they have to get saved.
You're right, because the other things that we're seeing happening right now is there are more people talking about legalization of certain drugs. There are more people talking about legalization of prostitution, which to me would be completely wrong. And people point to the examples in Nevada where they say, well, it's legal here and it works just fine. And I think that doesn't mean that it's a good system, because if you legalize something like prostitution, of course, more people will see prostitutes or be prostitutes. It's just natural. If you legalize these sorts of activities, you're going to have more people performing those activities and claiming that they're correct. And so I think our societies are starting to get too far to the left. And actually, I had been a professed Democrat for many years, but I recently just said no more. They're going so far to the left on some issues that I've decided I'm back in the middle. I'm not going to be picking this Democrat idea, because I don't like what they're doing with the legalization of prostitution. Some of their socialist ideas, like paying off something like 45 million students' college loans. That's what one person is talking about doing, or a couple people actually, Bernie Sanders and Omar. And it would just be crazy. And so I'm seeing these kind of things that we're seeing that aren't good ideas coming out of that party. So,
You're right.
Besides the Green New Deal, which is a disaster, it's cost us $93 trillion over 10 years. No, that doesn't work for me. So.
And I can tell you, as a pastor in Las Vegas, I used to pastor in Las Vegas before I started pastoring out here in Texas. And I can tell you, you're right. I had to pick up the pieces many times, or try to, of men going off to brothels and so forth. It's not pleasant what comes with it. And to make it legal is just crazy. But they're into craziness, you know. They're just, the Christian worldview is they're putting off the leftists, and let's just go hog wild, basically. So it's kind of sad. Let's shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to ask you a question about the evidence or proof for the Christian worldview. You said that you were raised a Catholic, so you obviously had some structure of Christianity within your lifestyle. But what kind of evidence or proof have you found? Because I know you've dialogued with so many scholars recently that you found really compelling for you.
I think the strongest evidence for Christianity, and going back to what St. Paul said, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if we just take the minimal facts that Gary Habermas has cited, if we just look at the minimal facts surrounding the crucifixion by Pontius Pilate, the empty tomb, the apostles who initially were hiding out and suddenly became very brave and said they saw the risen Christ, and the fact that women discovered the empty tomb, there are a number of different things that people who are even secular accept surrounding that. The best explanation for all of that information is that Jesus rose from the dead. Any other explanation, such as the twin theory or this idea that he was never crucified, he wasn't killed, those aren't backed by what the early writers were saying. Even hostile people towards Christianity, such as Tacitus, even those people admitted, and Josephus admitted, that Jesus was crucified and he died on the cross. And then the apostles suddenly believed that they saw the risen Christ. And of course, according to our books, he was with them for 40 days. And if you look at how they spent the next 3 decades or so, at least, preaching for him, despite the fact that they were persecuted, mauled, stoned, beaten, beheaded, crucified, if you look at that stuff and you think logically, they saw the risen Christ. They didn't just see a vision, because a vision is not going to convince you to risk your life for not just a day or a couple of days, but for decades, just to completely abandon your family, to go out preaching, to do all of this kind of stuff that they did. That itself is extremely compelling. So if we accept the fact, you know what's funny? Some atheists have said to me, well, I'll give you the resurrection. but I'm not going to, and I say, you're going to grant me the resurrection, but you won't. And then I did a survey on Twitter and I asked atheists, I said, atheists, let me know, if you found out that Christianity were true, without a doubt, would you worship Jesus? And so 31% or so said they would worship Jesus, and 57% said no.
Wow. Wow.
That is telling. And I had a lot of respondents. So I think I have 418 respondents. So that's telling.
Well, I know that you have a lot of activity on Twitter. I think a lot of it is because of your attitude. You got a great attitude. You respect folks coming from different worldviews, even crazy folks. You're patient with them. How would you encourage other apologists to do that? Because our natural inclination is to be the prosecutor, to be the lawyer, and just really go after their, jugular. But you're more patient with that. What would you say is a good way for us to kind of focus that direction?
It's actually really hard. I have to admit, sometimes I haven't been as patient as I'd like to be, and I have blocked a lot of people because I have had people try to threaten my work and contact my employer. And so I have had to block some people because of that, because people have found out where I work and they've been emailing my provost for the last 3 years. So,
Kidding.
No, I'm serious, and I have the evidence and screenshots and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty bad. So I have had to do that. So, but to my provost's credit, he understands what I'm trying to do. He's actually, others in my school who've also been emailed by these people have read my timelines and said, they're claiming you're the bully, but really they're the bullies. They look at my timeline and they say the evidence looks pretty clear. They're the ones who are coming at you. So to the ones who come at me with a decent approach where they're treating me as if I'm a human, I respond to them and I'll answer questions, and I get on YouTube and I'll debate people. I'm completely open to that kind of stuff, and I've gotten on a number of atheist channels with very polite people. Some of them are very polite. They just are honestly curious, or maybe I just talked to a guy a couple days ago who was in England, but he was raised in an atheist family, and so he's never really had his eyes open to Christianity, and I was his first Christian interviewee. And so, and he treated me very politely and in a very sincere way. And I thought, I think this person probably at some point might make his way to Christianity. I can't see him staying away for his whole life. He actually told me he and his soon-to-be wife like to go to the Church of England every Sunday because they really enjoy being around people who seem so positive in that. So I thought, God is planting those seeds in this person.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people that were like me. Before I came to Christianity, I thought all religions were basically the same and none of them had any proof. So it blew my mind, like what you said, the proof of the resurrection just absolutely stunned me. And I know I've talked to many people in the past, similar to the gentleman you were talking to, that had no understanding that, yes, not only is Christianity different, it has all this proof and evidence.
You're right. And I'll tell you what also brought me to Christianity. And you might have heard it on my channel because I've said it a lot the past few days. But in my early 40s, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if Christianity has any merit to it. And I said a few prayers, and then I found myself sitting on a plane next to a pastor. And he struck up a conversation of all people, a pastor. He strikes up a conversation with me and he said, what do you want to do in life? And I said, well, I'd like to write books like C.S. Lewis's fiction children's books. And he said, well, have you read his adult books? And I said, no. And so he referred me to Mere Christianity and the Great Divorce and Screwtape Letters. And Mere Christianity, when I read that book and I read the trilemma, which basically said we cannot come to any patronizing nonsense about Jesus just being a great moral teacher. He did not intend that for us. He is either the Lord or he's Satan, or he's basically a lunatic. And so when we look at those options, it's very clear. Jesus is Lord. He's not just a great moral teacher. And that opened my eyes. As soon as I read that, I actually went and bought a bunch of books for my sister and brother and parents. And I want them all to see that. And so my sister's always been in the Christian faith, a Catholic, as I mentioned, but the rest of my family members have kind of veered away. But they didn't read the book yet, so I'm still hoping, and this has been a number of years. So hopefully.
Yeah, I think the intellectual part of Christianity is so important. With my children, all my children are now out of the house except for one, and they all are really strong Christians. They avoided all the real crazy stuff in the world. And what I try to do with them is to hook them up emotionally to Jesus, because nobody's like Jesus. Then spiritually with the word and with prayer and worshiping God. And then intellectually, they had to come to the table every night and explain what they saw in school that was proof or evidence for God's existence. And as they were toddlers, I kind of walked them through it. Then they get to be 10 and 12 and 14. And after 10, 15 years of that, it got really deep in them. And because I've noticed as a pastor, people will veer off with doubt, maybe emotionally, maybe intellectually, maybe both, maybe spiritually. And so I wanted that intellectual thing to always keep a stable position for them that they can't leave because they know this thing's true. You know what I mean?
I completely agree. I think that's wonderful. And God calls us, a lot of atheists will say, well, you have faith, it's blind faith, you don't have any reasons. And I say, no, that's exactly not the case. I've been searching for reasons to give to you for many years now, and I found so many reasons. I mean, besides the cosmological argument, the moral argument, which C.S. Lewis really lays out quite well in Mere Christianity, the teleological argument, looking at purpose and design in this universe. Those are just three of many besides Jesus's resurrection that give us a lot of evidence for God. And so I think it's wonderful you do that for your kids. That's I should do that for my kids, have them find evidence for God each day. I love that.
It seems recently that you've really focused on the moral argument at times. That's a really compelling one because it's hard to say there are no moral absolutes. Would you explain that to our audience a little bit, how effective that is and why you like that argument?
I absolutely love the moral argument. And why I love it is because we have to, there's the idea, the distinction between is and ought. So we have what we do and what we know we ought to do. And what God did, and it says it in Romans 2:15, is God planted a conscience inside of all of us. So we always have this sense that we could do better. And we could be better, and everyone has it. Everyone has this guilt when you do the wrong thing. And where did that come from? And so then I think I looked at some studies. I found a study. My first one that I found was by Shalom Schwartz, and it was in 2012. And he surveyed thousands of people all over the world. And there were about 10 values that everyone holds. And in the United States, we have high values of our practices are high in levels of achievement striving and in hedonism, which don't sound so great. And basically self-enhancement is what that is he's captured in. But in his surveys, he actually also wondered how everyone felt we ought to be. And no matter what the country was, all over the world, every single country, there's not any exceptions, every single country had the number one moral ought as benevolence. And every single country had the number two as universalism, and that's defined as caring for the environment and everyone, out groups and that sort of thing. And so benevolence favors the in groups, universalism favors out groups. So essentially taken together, it means that we're all hardwired for love. And the really cool thing about that is that's not the only study. I found other studies now. I found which one was it? There's a study by a person called Kinnear in 2000, and he surveyed 7 major world religions, atheism, humanism, and the United Nations, and he found the same thing. He found that everyone has this desire to seek meaning. Everyone has a focus on self-direction, to take moral responsibility for their own actions. Everyone has this desire for benevolence. He phrased it as the golden rule. And everyone has a desire to help the environment, which is basically the same thing as universalism. So we all have this inside of us. So the question is, if we're just simply evolved animals, where did this come from? Wow. And the atheists will like to say, well, we're evolved animals, and so we're born, our parents, for example, if our parents are empathetic, we're more likely to be more empathetic. And that's truly the case. And also the same thing, if our parents are selfish, we're more likely to be selfish. So we do inherit to an extent. But evolution is only descriptive. It can only explain our practices and our behaviors. It can't explain the fact that we have this prescriptive moral ought and moral duty to do the right thing. So evolution it basically is a category error to claim evolution explains a moral duty. So because it's a prescriptive moral duty. And so even biologists will admit that, well, yes, you're right, evolution can only be descriptive and can only explain practices. It can't explain this little innate sense that we have inside of us that makes us want to do the right thing. So I think that speaks to a benevolent moral lawgiver. I think that gives a really solid case, because if we're hardwired with these laws and we all don't want to break the laws and we feel really guilty when we do, where did that come from? And so, and there is a case where if you do all of the wrong things consistently over life, you might be able to sear your conscience, and it does say that in the Bible. But for the most part, humans are have this conscience, and so and the question is, it had to have come from a bigger source. So
yeah, sociopaths are rare. That's interesting material to add to the more argument to bolster it. And as you know, talking to atheists or skeptics, when you start mentioning research and studies, their ears perk up. So that's really good information for our listeners to gather. Let's talk about Islam. You mentioned Muhammad earlier, and you compared him to Christ, which there's really no comparison. It's almost like the opposite. You got light and you got darkness. What are some thoughts on yours on approaching Muslims, perhaps refuting Islam or bringing Muslims to Christ?
that's a great question. First, I want to refer any Muslims who are listening to this to listen to David Wood. David Wood was working with Nabil Qureshi, and Nabil Qureshi was his roommate, I guess, in college. And Nabil's passed on; he's with the Lord now. But Nabil had written a book called "Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus," and he said he just looked at the lifestyles of Muhammad versus Jesus, and that itself was one big factor in turning him to Jesus. And plus, Nabil, what's really cool about Nabil is he had a dream, and he cited this whole dream. He had a dream that he knew David, and he knew David had become a Christian, and they were roommates in college. And he had this dream that he saw David in this beautiful banquet, and David was sitting in the banquet, and he was standing at the door, and David was basically with Jesus, and the banquet was a banquet with Jesus. And Nabil said he looked at David, and David said something like, "Are you coming in? Are you going to join us?" And he didn't know what to do. And so that sign to him was a spiritual sign from God that Christianity is the real faith. And he said, just comparing Muhammad's lifestyle. Now let's think. He had 12 wives. He had one wife he got married to when her name's Aisha. He got married to her at the age of 6. And he consummated the marriage when he was 53 and she was 9. So that itself speaks to me, says something. I know people will say, "Oh, don't insult, that's the culture back then." Well, I also know that if I compare him and the culture back then to Jesus in his culture back then, look how Jesus lived.
Amen. Yeah, that's good, because there's nobody in history that can compare to Jesus. Stack them all up, they don't compare. But Muhammad is like the anti-type, He's like just a warrior, take no prisoners. I think you mentioned earlier he had people slaughtered. I think it was even 900 Jewish men. One day he had their heads cut off. So, and there's no proof for Islam, which is also interesting. You have all this proof, some of which you've already mentioned, for Christianity. There's none from Islam. And so I think as more and more Muslims come to our country, we need to know a little bit about Islam and reach out to them and care for them and pray for them.
Yeah, and that reminds me of another point. The Bible was written over 1,500 years by 40 authors, 66 books in 3 continents, 3 languages. And the Quran was written over just one generation, Muhammad, and over a lifetime in years, and in one language in a single place. And there are some faults in the Quran. Like, for example, during Ramadan, Muslims are told that they have to fast from sunrise to sunset for 30 days in the summer. And the timing of the Ramadan varies in the summer. Sometimes it's June, sometimes it's July, sometimes it's August. But no matter when this timing is, and I think it might even go into May sometimes, but whenever the timing is, there's never a way to actually follow the Quran to the letter by fasting from sunrise to sunset if you happen to live in places like the northern hemisphere up in northern Sweden, because it's light all the time there during those hours. So it's impossible for them to follow the Muslim faith. But if you go back if you look at our Bible, there's only one time in the Bible where God calls on people to fast from sunrise to sunset, and that's Yom Kippur, which is in the early October. And I checked the globe. It just happens that there's no place on it. We don't have full sun and we don't have full night. Anyway, that happens to be the one time a year, or one of the times of the year that this is the perfect time to have this occur. So when people are told to fast, it works out perfectly well, no matter where you are on the globe.
That's an amazing fact. I had never known that. I've even written a book on Islam. I didn't know that one. That's powerful. And like you said, David Wood's ministry is really, really powerful. And people can go that for, really good stuff on Islam. But what do you think about when you talk about the aggressive atheists? You seem to kind of, on some of them, you said obviously others were just so hostile you had to, block them at times. But you've also been able to deal with, I've seen atheists that had a hard time with other Christian apologists. What would you say for the Christian when it comes to an aggressive atheist? What should we do? I know at some point you might have to block them if they get too nasty, but assuming that perhaps they might be open to dialogue, what would you recommend for the average Christian?
I think that we should try to be as Christ-like as possible and listen to Romans 3:15, because I think that that's really important. It's difficult, and I think a lot of atheists are atheists because of bad Christian experiences that they've had. Some of them were raised in Christian homes where their parents basically said one thing and did another thing in some cases, or they were raised in a church where maybe they were abused in some way. So I think we have to be as gentle as possible with them, just to realize maybe they came from a bad Christian experience, or they had a bad Christian experience, and this is their way of rebelling. And give them time, and the Lord will lead them back if they have the hearts for that. And so I think that's important. And just to try to be patient, because they're not just going to convert while we're talking to them on a Twitter account. That's not going to happen. They say, oh my gosh, you're right. He resurrected. Well, I'm coming to be a Christian now. I have yet to hear that. But I have heard.
Yeah. So that's probably another reason you build friendships too. I noticed you built friendships with Steve McRae. Is that his last name? Yeah.
Yes. Steve's a very controversial, what he calls temporal agnostic. And he just got in a little battle with his former partner on the Non Sequitur show. So now he's veering off on his own. But he's one I've formed a friendship with him and a few others. And I think that's important. And I think I don't know if he'll ever listen to this, but I think he will be coming back to Christianity at some point. I don't see him as a lifetimer. Atheism only has a 30% retention rate, according to the Pew Research. So we have to remember that too. Many of them later in life turn around.
I got that from you, and I've used that recently. That's a good step to know. The atheists don't like hearing about that on Twitter, so I mentioned that to them. But yeah, Steve seems, I don't know him at all, but you do. He seems like a really nice guy, very thoughtful and very intellectual. And obviously some apologists have got him mad, but generally he seems to be a really patient guy. But I liked what you said about not being basically a hypocrite, is, to sum it up. And with my children, I did that also. I said, when I made a mistake, morally or intellectually, whatever, and they pointed out, I go, I'm so glad that you pointed out. Dad really makes mistakes at times. I really need Jesus. So I wanted my children to know that I need Jesus. That's the main thing. And I think we can carry that over to skeptics and non-believers and atheists to let them know, look, we're not holier than thou. We need Jesus every single day.
Yeah, churches are hospitals for sinners, right?
Amen. That's a really good way to put it. Now, I have a question. Today, more women are engaging in the apologetic field, yet the numbers are still small. As a successful female apologist, what do you advise the local church perhaps to do, or some apologetic ministries, to raise up and equip more women as apologists? Is there any way to get more female defenders of the faith?
That's a great point. I think if the church would plant more women in some different administrative roles, that might help. If you had women maybe leading the children's ministry or doing things like that, I think involving them in that way in the church. I recently had a woman named Lori, who's from Texas, who actually was a former Miss Texas on my channel. And she was with me and Lisa Quintana. And Lori is now working in a church. I think that's what she's doing, is leading up the children's ministry, which I think is wonderful. And she and Lisa and other women that I've met, Nancy Piercy's another one, Lydia McGrew, I've had them on my channel too. You're right, there aren't as many women, and even if I look at the books I've bought, it's rare I have one from a woman. It's probably every 10 books, maybe the 11th one is from a woman. So there aren't as many women for some reason doing this, and I'm really not sure why. But Lisa Quintana is part of this thing called WIA, Women in Apologetics. And I joined that. And so we're trying to promote more women and get more women involved. And so they're going to have a conference at Biola in January, and to try to, again, involve more women. So I think those little things maybe can grow and blossom.
That's fantastic. What's the website address for that, if anybody wants to get to, or the name where they could look it up?
Just all you have to type in is Women in Apologetics. And I think it's womeninapologetics.com, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that's wonderful. And what you mentioned about the Sunday school, as a pastor, what I do is I try to have our Sunday school teachers add apologetic material to their lessons constantly. I want it constantly in there. So that helps make them an apologist. Perhaps the church can have some of them come up and share things in their own life, how the apologetics has worked in their lives as women. And that might be something that could help also, like you said, at the local church level, might be effective also.
That's a great point. And actually, that was part of the reason I came to Christianity in this process in around 2012, 2013, 2014. I started working in my church as in the children's ministry, and I started doing Sunday school classes because my kids were young then, and I was wanting to run the classes that they were in. And that's where I started digging into the Bible much more than I ever had, and started learning a lot of stuff. And so it helped. I was getting educated, and then I was educating fifth graders. So it was working out quite well.
And look at you now. One reason that God sovereignly put that pastor next to you in that airplane, and the rest is history, right? God just works in the most amazing ways. In fact, I even spotted when I was getting on the plane, I'd spotted that pastor in the line, and he was tall, he was thin, and he had something very ethereal about him. It was almost like a light around him, like he was an angel. And he sat next to me. I couldn't believe it. That was God's plan, and it's really helping a lot of people around the world just because so like you said earlier, you never know when you reach out to people what can happen, right? He had no idea that if he mentioned that you're going to be this apologist with YouTube channel and a Twitter accounts really touching a lot of people all around the world. He had no idea. He was just reaching out to you, helping you out a little bit, and look what it's done. So that's a good word for all of us.
That reminds me of something. Now, I've read 6 books by Hugh Ross, and Hugh Ross is a cosmologist. He's an astrophysicist, and he's he's brilliant. And I've read 6 of his books, and he said something really interesting. He said whenever he gets on a plane, about half the time, the person that he strikes up a conversation with on the plane just so happens to be either a pastor or a scientist or someone that he can actually help to bring to God and plant seeds. And these people are in the kinds of roles that he would be able to speak to quite well. So, he'd be on line maybe with another person who's an astrophysicist or something like that. And so he said it's beyond coincidental, because he actually calculated out what the percentage of people in the United States who happen to be in those roles, and it's something like 2%, but half the time the people next to him. So I think that's God. God does these amazing things.
Yeah, and all those people probably have others praying for them, and so then God pops Hugh Ross right next to him. I mean, what a great blessing, And that brings up another subject. I didn't think we were going to talk about this, and if you don't want to touch it, maybe you haven't come down on it yet. Are you? Because I'm kind of haven't come to my position, even though I've been doing this for 40 years, because I'm really attracted by Hugh Ross's material. And then I'm also attracted by some of the Reformed apologists that really are staunch young earth folks. Are you young earth at this stage, or old earth, or how would you describe yourself? And what would you say to the Christians that kind of want to divide over that issue? Why should we not?
Well, I think that, let me point out another pastor that I follow online a little bit. It's called Mike Winger. I don't know if you've seen his ministry, but he's very active, and he runs a ministry out of California. And he hasn't, I noticed that he doesn't take a position on the young earth versus old earth issue, because I think that he probably is leaning to an old earth, but I think he doesn't take that position because he doesn't want to disenfranchise the people who are the young earthers. Yeah. I think it's a difficult deal. I actually sit on the side of the old earth creationist idea, and I think the earth is 4.5 billion years old and the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But I don't see it as a dividing issue, because I feel like we should really focus on the resurrection rather than the book of Genesis and our interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11. And I've floundered a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what my interpretation is of Genesis 1 to 11, because if God did want to make the earth in a younger, 6,000 years, God can do that. He's completely capable of doing whatever he wants. Or if he wanted us to look at that as more of a metaphor, God could do that too. If Noah really walked the world, God could do that. If he wanted to put a flood over the whole world, or just a regional area, but kind of refer to it as if it's the whole globe, because it was their globe essentially, or their world at that point, God could do that too. And if Adam and Eve literally walked the earth, I'm fine with that too. And if he used evolution to bring Adam and Eve to the position that they were, if they actually evolved from apes, which I don't actually buy that really, but if they did, God could do that. It's completely possible. So I think that we should be kind of flexible towards our interpretations and not be very dogmatic about it, because we don't want to turn those people away who are very dogmatic. And so that's why I purposely haven't taken the strongest position on Genesis 1 to 11, because I'm honestly unsure. I'm unsure of how God did what he did, but we're just the beneficiaries of this creation in Jesus Christ. And so I think that we're very fortunate. You know, a little known fact.
What?
A little known fact that I think people don't recognize. A lot of people try to say, well, people have been around for 100,000 years. We've had Homo sapiens sapiens walking the planet for 100,000 years. And yet I look at the Population Reference Bureau, 57% of the people, of the 108 billion people they estimate have walked the earth, lived after the year 1. So 57%. So that means in the last 2,000 years, we've had the majority of people have walked the earth after Jesus Christ. And I think a lot of people who use that old 100,000 year argument and say, why didn't Jesus come a lot earlier? Well, think about how the population now is exploding. And if given maybe a couple thousand more years, and maybe we'll see 99% of people who've walked after Jesus Christ. So
yeah, Hitchens used that argument a lot, but there goes that right out the window. That's a really good point. Now, I think most thoughtful Christians would say, well, we shouldn't divide over these secondary issues. They're important issues. Talk about them. Open the Bible. Let's look at the facts, but let's not divide over them. And yet, in practice, unfortunately, especially some apologists, they do divide over those issues and start getting to name calling and stuff. So I hope that we get more gracious and charitable towards each other on some of these secondary issues, whether it's end times, spiritual gifts, interpreting Genesis, those type of things, because the world needs Jesus. I mean, let's face it, they really need Jesus. And if you're a brother or sister, that's good enough for me,
I agree. And I agree with you on the point of not getting divisive. And C.S. Lewis said something like that. He said, atheists should never witness two Christians arguing with each other over dogma. And I think that was pretty wise of him. And C.S. Lewis was almost a genius he was a genius, I would say, in some ways. And one of the ways is, no matter what your faith is, whether you're a Catholic or you're Protestant or you're in different denominations, he figured out a way to speak to all of us in his Mere Christianity. And he has people who are supporters in all these different denominations. And I think that was genius. So that's what we want to be. That's a role model.
He was an amazing guy, really amazing. His work is just phenomenal. I want to do a whole show on him. I think you did a show recently touching on something with C.S. Lewis. What was that about?
I wanted to tell people about that pastor on the plane story and how Mere Christianity was a game changer for me. So I started the show off talking about the trilemma. And I'm not the only one. I've actually encountered a lot of Christians online who've become stronger Christians or new Christians because of the trilemma. And one of them is Francis Collins. I haven't talked to him, but he's a Human Genome Project. He's a major scientist, and he came to Christianity. One of the things that really cemented it for him was the trilemma. So I think that's beautiful. C.S. Lewis, just that one little paragraph. And I read, my brother now is an agnostic, and I read the trilemma to him, and it didn't do anything. So I know it doesn't work in every case, but I'll keep trying, keep hammering away.
Part of the case works if they've actually read some of the Gospels like that. I got saved in a 7-Eleven store by a Jesus freak guy. But after I got saved, I went home. My life was perfect. At least I thought it was. So I told, if this thing ain't true, I'm not going to follow. I'm not going to change my whole life unless Christianity's true. And so I investigated all the world religions, found they had no proof, only Christianity did. So now I'm in. Now I start reading the Gospels, and I'm blown away at Jesus. I've never read anything like Jesus. And I read Plato, all the old classical writers. Nobody was like Jesus. And he had my heart at that point. I was done and over. He had me completely captured. And that's what I encourage people is make sure you get Jesus in there at some point. I know there's a place where you don't want to throw pearls before swine if the person is really, brutal and stuff. But I think placarding Christ, making sure people understand about who Jesus is really important. Wouldn't you say that's correct?
I completely agree. Jesus is the reason. Just like they say, Jesus is the reason for the Christmas season. So.
He's the reason we're Christians, right? In fact, for me, if it wasn't for Jesus, I would not be a Christian. Even if all the evidence was there, all the proof was there, I don't care. He's so important to me. He's the one that makes it all worth it.
He is. He's a game changer. And I listened to C.S. Lewis's. I've read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity more than once. I've read it a few times, but I actually just found an audio version of the book. So I was listening to it today and yesterday. It's 5 hours and I haven't finished it yet, but I've been listening to it while riding my bike. And he said something that I think is pretty neat that kind of relates to what you're saying. Before you find Christ, you might think your life is perfect and you might think you're a pretty decent character, But after you find Christ, you start realizing all of your flaws. You see that you have a lot of room for improvement, because now you've got the standard right there, and you say, how can I be like that? Because that's not how I am. And so he changes us. He also makes us understand where we have the flaws.
That's so important. It's important for Christians too, that Christ died for Christians too. And a lot of my audience obviously is Christian, and we make mistakes. And what I try to tell folks is, look, the standard is this. Jesus said, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father's perfect. If you pull that off without Christ, okay, you can make it. No one's pulled that off except for Jesus. So just know you need Jesus every day, and keep it simple. You know, we make things so complex sometimes. The simplicity of Jesus really can help us with our own lives and our family and our churches.
You're right. And I just started, I decided I was going to read the Old Testament, and because I wanted to try to find stories to put, because I've read the New Testament a billion times, it seems. And I thought to myself, and I have read the Old Testament sporadically and in chapters, but I haven't ever started from the very beginning and just gone through to sort of understand everything going exactly in the order in which it's presented. And I discovered stories like Joshua. I don't mean Joshua, I mean Joseph, Joseph, and the way that his brothers all sold him into slavery. And he went in there, and he ended up, they didn't recognize him when they ended up going through this whole famine and that kind of thing. And then he hugged them and forgave them. And we actually also have some pretty neat examples in the Old Testament of role models like him.
Yes. Yeah, and they're types of Christ also. When you see their lives, you can see that they're pre-picturing Christ, and it shows the unity of scriptures that you mentioned earlier, that all these different writers over a period of time, they're all saying the same thing. You know, it's really amazing, and it's all about Christ. What is your vision for your ministry at this point? I mean, you've had such great success already, but do you have any new projects underway, or you're going to do some books? What are you looking at in the near future?
I have written over 130 blog articles. And so I actually just put a bunch of them together into a book. And I'm trying to, the reason I'm going in the Old Testament is because I'm using some stories. I've already woven in some stories from the New Testament. And I've talked about things like Daniel 9, predicting the date of Jesus' crucifixion, and when combined with Ezra 7. And I've talked about Isaiah 53, because that pastor on the plane also directed me to Isaiah 53, which I had never read. And so he got me to think about that. But I've already done that, and I've talked about some New Testament things, but I thought I'm going to find people in the Old Testament that I can weave in to my book, and to kind of bring people back to reading the Old Testament and understanding how that pointed to Christ. And I'm using the story of Joseph as one of those that is an example of someone who forgave. And then the other thing about the Old Testament that's kind of funny, there were a lot of people doing all the wrong things, and all the warts are exposed. So if the story's made up, why would someone make it up to have the warts exposed? Or even in the New Testament with the apostles denying Jesus and hiding out, and he wasn't even buried by his own people. He was buried by the Sanhedrin, So you look at these embarrassing sorts of pieces that are all throughout the Bible, and you think to yourself, if God were making this up, he certainly would have made up a story where everyone was just wonderful, and we're all forgiving everyone, and no one's cheating on their wives, and no one's doing all the horrible things that we see all throughout the Old Testament. So I think so that's what I'm working on. I want to put a book out that gives as much proof as I can possibly give, and I might even get to the point where I release it for free just to get it out there. So because I have a day job, so I don't need to make money in this case. I'm just here to be a voice for God. So.
Well, that's wonderful. When you complete that project, let me know, and I'll make sure that all of our viewers and social media folks find out about it. But that'll be great. It'd be wonderful coming from your perspective. My last question is for you is, what is your favorite Bible verse, and can you tell us why that might be your favorite?
Oh, that's a tough one, because actually I like a lot of them. But I'll have to say it's John 3:16, the classic. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, for whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. You can't beat that.
Yeah, you're right. And I think you mentioned on a recent show what your favorite Bible book was. And I think you said Matthew, if I recollect. I could be wrong on that. Mine's John, and it's not a matter of battling Matthew versus John, but I know if I found John on a deserted island, I could get saved. Of course, you could with Matthew too, right? But John is, written for people to get saved. So John 3:16 is so powerful, and it's something that just explains what people need to know to get saved, because that's what it's about, is getting people saved. And so I want to thank you so much for your time, SJ. Sorry for the earlier problems. Our audience may not know this, but I had a power outage earlier. So SJ,
Oh, no worries.
yeah, I really appreciate that, and I'm going to pray for your ministry. Is there any place, you said you're not really seeking much support, such that, but is there any place that people can go for your website or YouTube channel that you want to give them?
Oh, I'd love that if you just type in S.J. Thomason, you'll find my YouTube channel. And my website is christian-apologist.com. And so I'm very active in posting blog articles there. And what I do is I ride around on my, it sounds funny, but I ride around and I listen to YouTube videos a lot. And that helps me to get ideas on different types of topics to cover. And so I cover a wide variety of topics on there because there's a lot of brilliant people out there speaking for God. And so in whatever way, if I hear a message and I think that is a really insightful idea, I'll try to write something on it too. So, and YouTube, I've been trying to, my channel has been about, lately it's been about bringing a lot of authors on. So I've brought a lot of authors onto my channel, like Gary Habermas and Hugh Ross, Ken Samples and Lydia McGrew. And I'm trying to, and Nancy Piercy, I'm trying to promote them. And so that's one thing that I like to do. I also like bringing non-believers on just to have a cordial conversation. And of course, I like bringing fellow Christians on. If anyone wants to come on, like you, if you'd like to come on, I'd love to have you on and we can have another conversation.
That'd be wonderful. And I noticed you had Craig Bloomberg on, I think recently, or maybe it just came up on my.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a really good interview. And so I encourage my audience, go to SJ's channel, because like she said, it's very diverse topic. So whatever you're feeling like, you can sit back and drink a cup of tea or coffee and really enjoy an interesting subject. And SJ, again, I thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to meet you, and may God richly bless you in your ministry.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to meet you too.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, how do I?